Hello everybody, welcome. I'm out for a very late night walk. Tonight, I'm going to talk about some of the fundamental mysteries in the context of our humanity. To begin, I'll list a few of them. Dreaming. What is dreaming? What is it really? If we knew more about everything, what would we think dreaming is? Birth. Why are we born? Why are there organisms? Why are there beings that seem distinct? What is death? What happens after death? Is there an after in death? So, this evening, a friend of mine, very close friend, was deeply disturbed by having had a dream in which he was to be executed. And his dream is personal, so I'll not share it here. What does it mean to die? One might think, many people do think, that or rather they don't think much about death. They would think that death is something we don't concern ourselves with until it becomes immediately proximate to our direct human experience. And we all have experiences throughout our lives where someone dies. Eventually, that someone is us. But, we hope, not today. Today I'm alive. And perhaps tomorrow I'll be alive. We don't know. We think we don't concern ourselves much with death, and yet to know that we will die is a very profound thing. Even if we don't know precisely, quote, what will happen, unquote, when we die. And there's all kinds of stories about this. Most of the religions are deeply concerned with the narrative of what happens after we die. Or with presenting a narrative. And frankly, in almost every religion, the fact that we die will be weaponized in a wide variety of senses, and sometimes in nearly every sense we could imagine. We will be threatened with what will happen if we fail to live well and according to some apparent catalog of laws. A number of my close friends spend nearly all of their time concerned with this peculiar presentation. Death is one of the profound mysteries of life. And we may think we have no experience of it, but it occurs to me at least that dreaming might be practice for death. I had a long conversation with my friend who was very troubled by his dream. But whether or not we think that death is proximate or nearby in time, we're all aware of it in a kind of fundamental way, in a way that's deeper and richer and broader and more profound than any of the stories we've heard or any of the beliefs we may hold. In fact, our fears about failure and loss clearly are fundamental presentations of our concerns with what we may believe is the cessation of this existence. My friend who had this dream seems to fully believe that death is the absolute end point. All things are gone, ending. Nothingness, no possible continuation of any aspect of being across that divide. And most of the people who believe this are atheists or agnostics. He suggested that it was a salve, an ointment, a medicine, that we who believe in the continuation of at least some aspect of being across that divide enjoy. He thinks of that as a comforting thought. Yet it is not merely a comforting thought for most of the people who believe in the continuation of something of us after death. Also believe in something like sin, or error, or that for which we might suffer, or be punished in whatever follows the cessation of the physical, biological processes we associate with being alive. And we spoke about the effects on morality of both sides of the belief, but both that there's a continuation of something and that there's not. He suggested that those who thought there was no continuation would be even more deeply drawn toward moral and ethical behavior, to which I responded, well, some of them. Certainly not all of them. And he went on to suggest that nearly everyone is ethical and moral in their own peculiar way. And so it is very rare to come across someone who's inherently bad. And there's some truth in that perspective. But what he didn't realize was that most of the people who believe in the continuation of something after death also believe in a kind of accounting game where someone or something, or the laws of the universe, or whatever we might ascribe agency in this matter to, involve themselves in something resembling judgment at death or beyond death. And so the belief in the continuation of being after death is not merely a comfort. It's also terrifying, because it is in the light of death that we who suppose something occurs afterward, something continues, whatever. We fear judgment. We fear this accounting game. many religions, whether they suppose there is an avatar or angel or God itself. Rather, we should say the self. We should have a new word here. The being. We all fear, or are at least concerned about, whether or not we have lived well and what the consequences of not having done so perfectly, which none of us do, may be. And so we have a conscience. Then, of course, there are those who would like to live forever. The very confused people who think that the longer we can cling to this particular body and mind, the better it is. This is a very confused kind of fantasy, founded primarily in the ego and the left hemisphere's desire to grasp onto identity forever, at any cost, at every cost. The wise person sees immediately through this and realizes something like or resembling it's good to get another go at being human in a new body, in a new life, with new parents, with a body adapted to the world it's born into rather than being 100 years off, 1,000 years off. Death is good if there's continuation of the self across that barrier of some kind. Now, of course, there isn't continuation of the ordinary self. My identity will certainly dissolve at death. And it's not my goal here to present models or my own perspectives or beliefs, but rather to explore. I'm walking down to a 7-Eleven on a quest to acquire Frosted Flakes. Meanwhile, I'm exploring ideas about death. So, my goal here is to pose questions and offer some perspectives. Personally, it seems foundationally unlikely to me that death is the complete end, full stop, of every aspect of what I am. In fact, what I am is distributed over multiple individuals and positions in time-space, relationships. It's not just local to my body, so my physical death, while it certainly is the end of this body, it seems unlikely that it's the end of me, or my soul, and by my soul I mean a complex thing, not a singular thing. I mean something like a constellation of relationships in which the nearest stars are instanced in a human lifetime as me, and there's some transcendental world to which I am always fundamentally not connected, but I'm an instance of it. Connected would mean I was parted from it first and then connected back to it. I suspect that's not the case. And something quite astonishing is afoot. Though I will admit that I don't know. We have every night that we sleep a series of profound and distinct experiences, though they are part of a related continuum. We have experiences of hypnagogia, the onset of dreaming, which differs from dreaming and waking world consciousness, and yet is near to both of them. We have dreaming itself, of which there are probably 1,000 varieties, if not more. We might even say that each dream is a unique variety of dreaming. We have deep, dreamless sleep, which we might imagine could resemble death. And we have hypnopompia, which is the nascent onset of waking. And if we have experience of hypnagogia or hypnopompia that we are conscious of, these things are often profoundly non-ordinary, unlike anything we are prepared to understand. They're wildly, shockingly bizarre, and redolent of transcendental implications. I'll pause now for a moment, because I'm getting near my destination. 7-11. All right, I've acquired the ridiculously desired Frosted Flakes. So I was hoping to get a box. I just got a little packet, and now I can return home. So one might argue that much of the flash and flexing of common human life is a display behavior that flaunts our immortality. The gigantic trucks, the guy who rode by on his motorcycle at 1 a.m, blasting music that could be heard a mile away. Sports, ball games, all of these kinds of things. I don't think that's the most important thing I can focus on here, but it's something I want to get into the conversation. Fashion, flair, pride, arrogance, all of these things have some relationship to death. And in our teenage years, we enter a series of developmental phases where we are testing our vulnerability to or our invulnerability to death. And so teenagers are well known to be little death defiers. They engage in crazy adventures, drug use, wild sex, suicidal activities or activities that could easily get them killed. Meanwhile, most of the adults are scratching their heads and wondering, what the fuck is wrong with these kids? Well, maybe something's right with them. Maybe that's the natural way to be a teenager. And I think there's something true about that, having been one myself. Admittedly, many of my teenage adventures that fall into this category were cries for meaning, rebellion against meaningless roles and absurd societies and situations that I could not affect. And I think this too is common. I've been close to death a number of times. I've narrowly avoided it on a number of occasions. I remember once when I was a runaway teenager, some friends of mine and I went out to the woods to cut up a couple cords of wood and then sell them in an effort to get some weed. And I was riding on that wood in the back of a truck. My three friends were in the front. And as we passed through Monterey, I tapped on the door and said, "Hey, I'm hungry. I'm going to try and steal a chocolate pie. Let me out here." 4 miles later, they flipped that truck and were involved in a terrible accident near Cazadero, California. Once I had a fever so severe that I was paralyzed and there was black pus coming out of my throat. I was paralyzed for 3 days and I couldn't tell anyone that something was wrong because I couldn't move. I ran like 106, 107 fever for 3 days. And I was pleading for death at that point. One of the peculiar ideas, and this is typical of our modern humanity, is we have a single word to refer to something that's 10,000 different things. Or at least 10,000 differentiable things. 10,000 things we would like to be aware exist instead of just thinking they're one thing. So that most people think that when we die the same thing happens. And one thing that came up in our conversation this evening was that my conversation with my friend who'd had the terrifying dream was that it's entirely possible for both things to be true. In other words, for some people, death is the end. That soul path comes to a complete cessation. Possible. And for others it is not. In the same way that for some people, to be born is immediately to die. Some babies die immediately after birth. They don't live. They don't have life. Birth doesn't lead to life. For those of us who are listening, it did. But for some children, it doesn't. We should notice that. And so birth, in the same way that birth is nothing like the same thing for every person, perhaps death is similar. In fact, it's not really perhaps, it must be similar. Some people believe that death leads to reincarnation. This is considered blasphemy in other religions that don't believe this, or some of them. And when most people think of reincarnation, they think of it rather in a rather silly way. They think of it too simplistic a way. They think, I will be born again as a human on earth in the future. But what if each birth isn't local to you? What if your birth involves 50 different people or 10,000 people in a unique topology of identity so that you are part of 10,000 people? And when you have affinities with people, this is partial recognition of an aspect of yourself, right? We all think, no, I'm a separate person. It's not likely. There's nothing in nature that's much like that. Your own mind isn't like that. The thing you're thinking with isn't like that. It comes from incredibly sophisticated trees of ancestry. We acquire our minds, we develop them in and with thousands of other people and media and the world and so on. Perhaps this isn't relevant, but earlier I was thinking some humans become confused and think, wow, those moths are really stupid, they just go toward the light. Why did they do that? And yet those same humans are glued to their smartphones and computer screens and TV screens all the time. They don't notice that. And this is somehow relevant. In many spiritual traditions, there's something that at least resembles the idea of karma, which fundamentally isn't like how we are trained to think about it. We're trained to think about it as kind of an accounting of good and evil done in life, and that the good and evil done will be visited upon us in this or a future lifetime. Now, the thing I said earlier about each of us being born in 10,000 people, but locally to one, we might think of it as being born in 1 million organisms or 1 trillion organisms. Your own body is more than 1 trillion organisms. It's 50, 60 trillion cells, only half of which are human. So it should be obvious from that fact, and the fact that we didn't acquire half of our cells from our gene line, that we are collective beings. We are concretions, right, in time-space. And that concretion doesn't have to be local to this time, or this world, or this place, or anything like that. There's no reason to suspect that it should be, except that this is our standard way of being trained to think about it. We may be, and I think it's likely that we are, a unique local instance of all beings in all of time. Seemingly separate, actually unified, but blind to this fact. And so when this body dies, what is actually dying? A local point of presence of that layered infinity of clouds of beings, transcendental beings, embodied beings, inorganic beings, stones and mountains and oceans. What dies when we die? This body, yes. This mind, not clear. Some portion of it, likely. Most of us naturally fear death. I do. But for reasons stranger than are common. There's a scene in Blade Runner where one of the replicants is talking with the Blade Runner, whose name escapes me at the moment. And he's talking about what he's seen, what he's uniquely experienced, and he's demanding that this is precious and must not be lost. This is, I think, what we truly fear. The loss of all that is precious and stored within us as an individual being, and seems local to that being and fragile. But I'm not sure it is, because I suspect that the nature of time-space is so profound that nothing is ever lost, fundamentally. Nor is it merely recorded. And if we're going to think about death, we should think about memory. And this is another thing for which we have a single word, but there are 1,000 kinds. Think of the kind of memory that's involved when you're improvising something. A dramatic presentation, you suddenly engage in humorous behavior. Maybe you are making music or writing or dancing. Or you are just simply wandering in a wild place. This is not recording. There are so many forms of memory. Thread memory, 20 kinds of dream memory, insight memory, realization memory, knowledge memory, intellectual memory. And even as I'm doing this now, I'm improvising, and so I am using the forms of memory that are associated with improvisation. I'm giving them play. I'm playing in and as them. So what is the self we are so afraid of losing? Who is the one who is afraid? And what truly do we fear? It's not my intention to answer these questions, but rather to preserve them, to resist the common answers and see beyond them, to reach for true insight, understanding, awareness, and even knowledge. The greatest mystery of all is death. And there's a reason why it's close to my heart at the moment. Many traditions pose our waking experience as a kind of structured dreaming in a context that is persistent, a context that persists across sleeping and waking and dreaming and so on. And so there's this illusion of a persistent self. But what about dreaming? Dreaming is not a persistent self. It's not even a persistent world. And we experience it, hopefully most of us, many times per week or many times per night, though some of us perhaps don't. There's some discussion in spiritual circles that dreaming is a sign of ill health, and that, for example, in Taoist philosophies and in Tai Chi, dreaming is seen as a sign of incomplete health or the need for some kind of healing. It's clear that not merely humans dream. We know that other animals dream. And perhaps there's something similar that happens even for plants and, who knows, bacteria. Insects almost certainly. My walk is nearly concluded and my thoughts are not. But I want you to expand your curiosity and your passion for learning around this topic of death and the related topic of birth and dreaming and waking, and how these things relate with each other in a fundamental way that ordinarily escapes our awareness. I will be doing what I'm recommending. And I'm grateful that we have this time to explore together and transform our minds. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.